Welcome to our Skype conference on the recent developments in the Eastern Mediterranean. We would like to welcome our friends from Netanya University as well as our broader audience on EMF Live. Our first speaker of the morning is Air Commodore Andrew Lambert. Andrew, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Who will speak about the changes in the regional balance of power. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'd like to have the first slide, please. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I suggest to you that we are at a strategic crossroads that is almost like the end of World War II. Despite the successes that followed on immediately after the 1991 battles in Iraq and then subsequent activity in the Balkans, we found that the unipolar world that came out of that has actually, over the last 16, 18 years, progressively disintegrated. We've had plenty of military solutions, for example, in Afghanistan and Iraq, also in the Arab Spring, in Libya, but of course then we didn't actually participate in the Red Line operation, if I can call it that, in Syria. We've had some success with Iranian nuclear weapons, so the question is for how long, and we still have the North Korean problem. But for all these situations, we do not seem to have any form of political solution. As Sir John Sawyer, the ex-head of MI6, said, what we need now is a situation that puts global stability first. We have looked for too long at the war on terror, and perhaps now we should be thinking again about the concert of Europe. Could I have the next slide, please? If this is the case, then we have to ask ourselves, what value is there then in the current situation where we have, in the West, been putting up this idea of liberal democracy? Unfortunately, that has been pushed to one side by many of the nations of the world. There is doubt about the validity of international institutions such as the United Nations. And worse than that, we now see increasing flouting of things like the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and the ICJ, the International Court of Justice. And nowhere was this more brought into focus than in July this year, when in the South China Sea dispute, China decided they would not accept any more the jurisdiction of the Tribunal for the UNCLOS. Which brings us to a question, are we back into a straightforward realist paradigm? The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. Next slide, please. So if we look at the South China Sea dispute, we can see a situation where indeed China has decided that it owns all the land, as you can see, inside the 9-dash line, the disputed islands, and yet the countries closest to those islands, it seems, have no rights because China has said they have historical rights there. Can I have the next slide, please? But there's also another rather insidious factor, and that's this post-truth concept. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, this is the international word of the year, and we've seen it brought into sharp focus in places like the Scottish referendum, where it didn't matter what the logical arguments were, the Scots still wanted to be free, whatever that meant. We've seen it in Russia to a large extent, mostly because of propaganda, and we see it, of course, in the Brexit vote that took place very recently, where lots of very good arguments were adduced. Virtually every single sane organisation in the world, from the President of the United States downwards, recommended that Britain stays within the European Union, but at the end of the day, the British voted to go. And now, of course, most recently, we've seen it with Donald Trump and the populist movement that seems to have propelled him into power. The post-truth era says this, that facts are secondary to emotion. So you can have any argument you like, but if you would want it to be the other side of the argument, then that is the one that wins. The assertion of belief trumps mere reality. Well, this is a problem because it means you can rewrite history if you wish, not only in the present but in the past as well, and one is back to the idea that history is the servant of politics. It's quite often manifested right now as petty nationalism, and it fills me with concern for things like elections in the future, for evidence in law courts, for international treaties and their application, even for such mundane things as going to the shops and buying something. It seems there's no longer such a thing as a lie or an untruth. It's just an expression of what you want or don't want. And so we end up in a situation where we are highly susceptible in the future because the Netherlands election is coming up in March, and God knows which way that will go. In France, of course, there is a good chance that Marine Le Pen will take power in a populist wave in the first round of elections in April and then finally in May. And of course, there are the German elections in September. Well, so this is the chaos in which we find ourselves. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to talk today about are the changes in the balance of power, and I really want to talk about Vladimir Putin, Theresa May and Brexit, and Donald Trump. And just in case you think that Brexit is irrelevant in this context, I should remind you that Britain still has the world's fourth largest economy and still has considerable global responsibilities. Next slide, please. So we are returning to a world where great power rivalry, it seems, is going to be the order of the day. Perhaps for too long we've worried about the war on terror, and now it seems we need to think, as I mentioned earlier, about a concert of Europe. And this is from the Financial Times of the 19th of October, just a month and a half ago. The first foreign policy priority of the next American president will be to work out how to avoid direct conflict with China or Russia, because both countries in different ways now challenge US dominance. And the wars between the great powers are once again a possibility. For better or for worse, we are returning to great power balance. Next slide, please. At the same time, we can see there has been a change in power. The old powers in Europe, and indeed in America, are losing their sway in the world. At the same time, we are seeing the rise of old new powers. Turkey, of course, closest to home from where we're standing. Turkey, as you'll recall, was the cornerstone of NATO and still hopefully is. But from 2002, when the Erdogan government came to power, the first act they did was to refuse the United States access to their bases for the invasion of Iraq. And then just this year, we've seen the Gulen coup, and I believe I'm right in saying, and certainly the BBC says this, 105,000 people have been imprisoned in various purges or thrown out of a job. And this is the largest imprisonment or purge really since Hitler, Stalin, or perhaps even the French Revolution. They're headed towards a one-party state, and it looks like a return to the old Ottomanism. That's Turkey. India, fastest growing economy until the latest catastrophe, with, of course, the withdrawal of all the high denomination banknotes. According to CNN this morning, that means that the main method now of carrying out trade is barter. So it's put them straight back into, the Middle Ages. China, of course, we've mentioned them already with the rise of their assertiveness in the South China Sea, and it's Russia that I want to talk about first. Well, let me start. Next slide, please. Let me start by having a look at the various defense expenditures. And if you look on the left side of this particular slide, you can see that shows the defense expenditure of the United States. And I don't want to go through the figures in too much detail, but you can see that during the Clinton era, defense went down and down and down. When Bush came to power in 2000, defense started to rise, and it rose fairly continuously during the Bush administration, reached a peak, and then since Obama's come to power, it has declined. So you can see the swings and roundabouts of administration expenditure. On the right-hand side is Russian expenditure. And it's no surprise, really, that during the period under Yeltsin, Russian defense expenditure fell down to the nadir that you can see, and then slowly rose during the period that, first of all, Mr. Putin was in, and then Mr. Medvedev, and then, of course, Mr. Putin again. But you can see the gradient is nevertheless upwards, ever upwards, and recently the gradient is increasing at the rate it's actually going. Next slide, please, which brings me on to a talk about Russia. And I think it's important to understand just where the Russians stand. And I've put there that Russia has been for a long time defensive, both in mind and body, and with some justification. Next slide, please. Russia itself is a product of conquest. And the main conquest that took place that really set the history of Russia in the first instance was the movement of the Vikings into Russia under Rurik, which occurred in the period just before 1000 AD. Nobody knows exactly whether the Russians are called Rus because they were rowers or Rus because of their red hair. But nevertheless, it is the Vikings that came and established themselves in Russia and took over and took command of the Slavic nation, the indigenous population, thereby creating a group of aristocrats, the Vikings, and serfs, the Slavs. And it's quite interesting that Yulia Tymoshenko, who was until recently Prime Minister of the Ukraine, used to dress with her blonde hair as if she looked like a girl from somewhere in the Baltic. She had the plaits and looked exactly like some sort of Viking maiden. And so you can see that amongst the people who have the power in that area, nevertheless they hark back to their time as part of a Viking greater power. But what of the other conquests? Next slide, please. Well, you'll have to bear with me. I will talk us basically through. From the southeast, waves of attacks have come. First of all, from the Mongols, who attacked in 1222, occupied Crimea, and beat the Russians in 1223, and then exited back to the Great Khan to tell him about the things that they had seen. They came back in 1237, marched on all the cities of Russia, vanquishing Moscow, Ryazan, and finally came in 1241 to Kiev. There they divided. The northern group went out and beat the Poles at Liegnitz, or Legnitsa, and then the southern group went and beat the Hungarians at Mohi. That was the effect of the Mongol armies, which then established themselves with the Golden Horde in the middle of Russia. But if that wasn't bad enough, at the same time that the Golden Horde was establishing themselves in Russia, Russia came under attack from the west. The Teutonic Knights and indeed the Swedish conquerors tried to move in and attack along the line of the Neva, and were defeated by a man called Alexander, who received the sobriquet Alexander Nevsky, and who is very much held in high esteem in Russia at present. They were then attacked again from the southeast by the forces of Tamerlane, who came up in 1382 and 1385. And after that, very fortunately, Tamerlane had to go and attack Delhi, conquered Delhi and essentially exterminated all the people before defeating the Ottomans. But if that wasn't bad enough, we have to think further forward into the modern era. In 1707, of course, Charles XII of Sweden attacked from the west and would have marched on Moscow but for Peter the Great's scorched earth policy. And literally everything to the west of Moscow was destroyed. There was no food, no shelter, and the horses were starting to starve. And so Charles XII had to move south and was eventually beaten by Peter at Poltava. We of course think about Napoleon, who invaded in 1812 and took Moscow. We then come further forward, of course, into more of the modern era, and we think in particular about the Nazi invasion in 1941. If you are a Russian, you find yourself in the center of a heartland that people stomp through with very great regularity. Next slide, please. Which means then that the Russian philosophy is to protect that heartland. And the way you do it, of course, is by establishing buffer states. And I've ringed 3 buffer states, one to the west, shown in the top left-hand corner, the area near the Caspian in the middle, and of course the Far East, which you can see also ringed. Next slide, please. The empire came to its greatest extent under Alexander III. Next slide. And it's quite interesting if you look at this picture by Repnin, which is, I think, in the Tretyakov Gallery in Moscow. Look at, there's Alexander obviously standing in the middle of this group of people, a great bear of a man, but look at the various nationalities that surround him, and it shows the diversity of the Russian population. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next one. That's it. Hold that one. So if you then look at what happened in terms of expansion and collapse, you can see that Russia extended itself very much to the west and to the south and to the east. But if you look on the right-hand side, you can see there the situation for Russia at the end of World War II. Of course, Russia at the time had the Warsaw Pact countries. So looking from the top, we look at East Germany, then down through Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, etc. They, of course, also controlled most of what happened in Finland, and Russia itself, or the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, included the countries of Latvia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Well, since the fall of the Berlin Wall, of course, the Warsaw Pact has collapsed, so that's the first line of defense gone. And then since then, of course, the Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia have declared independence. Belarus is partially independent, though still sings to a considerable extent to Moscow's tune. And of course, we've seen the things in Ukraine going on. Finland, meanwhile, is now pursuing a very much more European, Scandinavian posture. Next slide, please. So we find ourselves now in a situation where we have Russia concerned that all its buffer states have gone, and it looks as though President Putin is trying to reignite the Cold War again and perhaps to try and re-establish the spheres of influence that he used to have. But it's the difference. At the end of the Cold War, we had tied the Russians up in spaghetti, and these were the treaties that were there and were very successful. Next slide, please. Well, let's just go through the treaties. The first one, quite interesting, is the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty. I won't read out all the things on the slide, but it limited NATO and the Warsaw Pact to each have the holdings that you can see up there. Well, of course, that became irrelevant when the Warsaw Pact collapsed. But the difference was it allowed us to verify force levels in each of the Warsaw Pact and NATO countries. Unfortunately, that treaty has now been derogated from, and Russia declared in 2007 that it was suspending all treaty obligations under the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty. Next slide, please. We then have to look at nuclear weapons, and as you can see there, both Russia and the United States have roughly 7,000 nuclear weapons each. Now, you may think that's a sort of a fairly irrelevant factor. And indeed, for any person under the age of 45 who does not remember the Cold War, nuclear weapons are seen as arcane and irrelevant. And we end up in a situation then people just ignore nuclear weapons and think there's no reason to worry about them. But I suggest to you that there is a problem. Next slide, please. Under the New START limits, we have the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty limits. These are the limits that are applied between the United States and Russia. So they're limited to 700 deployed missiles and bombers. They're limited to 1,550 bombers and re-entry vehicles. But bizarrely, each bomber counts as one re-entry vehicle. But as we know, each bomber can have several bombs on board, which makes a bit of a nonsense of it. And they're limited as well to the number of launchers of 800. This is all to be achieved by February 2018 and will last till 2025. Next slide, please. The next factor that needs to be considered is the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which required there the total elimination of all nuclear and conventional missiles, as well as their launchers with ranges of between 500 and 5,500 kilometers. That's nuclear and conventional. And this was done because the SS-20, shown on the left up there, was a rapidly deployable mobile system that could hit anywhere in Europe. In response to that, you will recall under President Reagan, the Glickens, the ground-launched cruise missiles, were deployed. Some 464 were deployed in Europe. That showed that we could match the Soviets missile for missile, and as a result of that, people sat down and talked about how to get rid of them, and the INF Treaty was the result, and so both sorts of weapons have now been outlawed and are not supposed to be deployed. Next slide, please. So this is the situation that we find ourselves, and I want to talk now just a little bit about Vladimir Putin. Let's not forget that he has inherited the situation I've discussed. That is, a Russia that feels itself vulnerable, a Russia that feels itself likely to be pressurized, one that its borders have retreated and retreated, and it sees itself being threatened from all sides. They also, you will recall, during the period of Yeltsin, found themselves in a situation of utter degradation. People begging on the streets. In fact, interesting enough, when I was last in Russia, one of the girls there told me that her grandmother had just died, and when they looked inside all her wardrobes and all her cupboards, they found bread hoarded in great quantities with jam, because she was afraid that just such a situation would occur all over again. And so the Russians have decided, and Putin is the prime example of this, never again will this occur to Holy Mother Russia. And it seems really as though perhaps Vladimir Putin has learnt from Theodore Roosevelt, speak softly, but carry a very big stick. Next slide, please. So we come on to Russia's concerns. Well, it must never go through the degradation of the 1990s again, nor indeed the various problems that it had during the end of World War II. Russia wants to reassert itself as a great power, and that means having military power first. It needs to have its border security established. That includes places like Chechnya. It needs to have some buffer states re-established and have spheres of influence so that it can control what happens in those buffer states. It needs to make sure that its diaspora, which is far and wide, is looked after. It wants also to make sure that it's not so dependent on the price of oil and an oil-based economy. And to do all this, it's necessary then to control those that would do Russia down, the agitators, the people who are against the freedom that Russia seems to think that it needs. And of course, this is done very much these days through control of the television, and this is a recent change. Businesses are now taken over if they do not do what the party wishes. And one thinks also of people like Boris Nemtsov, who died, you'll remember, in very suspicious circumstances on that bridge just over a year ago. And I've put at the bottom freedom. And freedom, frankly, freedom in the way that we in the West regard it, is very much a low priority. Next slide, please. Well, let's see some of the justifications and some of the concerns that Russia does have. Can I have the next slide? If you look at both the Ukraine and the Baltic states, you would have thought, well, maybe Russia does have a point because, of course, there is a huge Russian diaspora in the Ukraine. But look a little bit more closely, and I hope you can see that it's only actually in the Crimea that the Russian population outnumbers the local Ukrainian population. In areas of the Donbass, the Russian population is about a third. So there's some mileage in saying, yes, well, we have to look after our diaspora, but perhaps invasion is not entirely justified. And indeed, when we look at the Baltic republics, just have a look. Estonia, 24, let's call it 25%, Latvia, 27%, and Lithuania, about 6%. So they don't really have much of a justification to interfere too much there, except the status of the Russians inside the Baltic republics is somewhat ambiguous. For example, the Russians inside the Baltics can vote in Russian elections, and do, and most of them voted for Putin. Interesting. A lot of them do not have voting rights inside the Baltic republics. In Lithuania, they were entitled to have full voting rights, but then that only amounts to some 6% of the population. And so there are a number of Russians who perceive themselves as disadvantaged. Next slide, please. I mentioned the reliance on hydrocarbons, and I put this up here to show how it is that when Putin came to power, just to the right of that red line on the left slide, of course, the price of oil, and you can see another red line where the price of oil started to rise. And it shows that the oil has been the main driver of Putin's expansion. And it's been quite a successful expansion, as we saw. Next slide, please. And if we look then at how Russian GDP has increased and Russian defense spending has increased, you can see they are very much in harmony. Well, let's talk about some of the possible problem areas. Next slide, please. The first one I want to remind you of is the INF Treaty, which says that every missile system between 500 and 5,000 kilometers is outlawed. We look at this particular missile, the Iskander, which is just being deployed now to the Kaliningrad Oblast, right in the middle there between Poland and Lithuania. And you have to wonder why it is that this particular missile has been there. Well, what happened in July 2014, the United States notified Russia that they thought a breach was likely to develop of the INF Treaty, that the Russians had possessed prohibited weapons. The Russians said that the treaty was now unsuitable for Russia and unfair because other countries in Asia already had such weapons. And it's probably likely that what they were referring to as unsuitable was because of the deployment of the Strategic Defence Initiative, radars and so forth into Poland and the Eastern European countries. Well, so hand in hand with that nuclear missile deployment, we should look at other Russian rearmament. Next slide, please. And I have to tell you, it's proceeding apace. Sputnik magazine has put out a piece of paper saying Russian military exceeds its rearmament plan by 17%. And that's probably true. Just this month, they carried out the first of a series of tests of anti-satellite weapons. Whether that means they'll be able to take out missiles, take out satellites in geostationary orbit, or indeed take out satellites that are using for GPS, remains to be seen. But it's certain that they see themselves as being very capable and desiring to be able to fight a battle in space. Next slide, please. On the ground, we see various other capabilities improving. The Armata tank, which is now just being deployed, is one of the most heavily armed tanks and most accurate tanks. It's probably, frankly, a world beater compared with all the current systems that are there. It will be extremely difficult to knock out. The vessel on the right is the Severodvinsk, which is a new nuclear-powered attack submarine which will be capable of carrying cruise missiles, land attack missiles, anti-ship missiles, and various anti-submarine missiles of all varying sorts. It is very quiet and will be very difficult to detect. Next slide, please. Just in case you thought that Russia was not keeping up with the Americans in terms of stealth, on the left is the new Russian stealth aircraft that is being introduced into service as we speak. It's the PAK-FA-T-50, and although it may not be quite as stealthy as, say, something like the Raptor or the B-2, nevertheless it will be difficult to detect. The picture I've got on the right is the Su-33. You will recall that the Kuznetsov and the Peter Veliky, Peter the Great frigates, went down through the English Channel just recently. And I found it quite interesting that on the Kuznetsov, as they progressed along through British territorial waters, they had two Su-33s on deck alert all the way along, presumably saying, we're ready to take on all comers. Not exactly the sort of thing you do in friendly territorial waters. Next slide, please. In fact, can we go on one more slide? So we come on then to the Ukraine crisis. I said to you that 58% of the people in Crimea are natural Russians. And okay, we know that Crimea was taken, and there's some justification for that. Russia originally took Crimea under Prince Potemkin on the orders, of course, of Catherine the Great. So naturally it was part of Russia. But I ask you this question: is that really the way to take over or take back your original possessions? Just to march in and kick the Ukrainians out? One wonders. Next slide, please. And if that isn't bad enough, there is a nuclear dimension as well, and it's this. Just recently in Moscow, and I believe St. Petersburg as well, civil defense exercises have been carried out where civilians are being got to their bunkers and told to do what to do in the case of a chemical or a nuclear attack, thereby creating the mind in the civilian mind that they are possibly under attack already or likely to come under very soon. And Dmitry Kiselyov, as you can see here, said that any clash of US-Russian forces in Syria could escalate dangerously. Well, that's sure. But then the next line becomes telling. Impudent behavior by America has a nuclear dimension. Well, that sounds like an official view and is extremely worrying, because if we are now moving towards the sort of confrontation that we had in the Cold War, without the treaty obligations and without the treaty effects of the Cold War, it becomes very unbounded. Next slide, please. So we come on to this question. Is there a risk of miscalculation, or are we moving into a compromise? Next slide, please. At the recent meeting, as you recall, of the both houses of parliament in Russia, President Putin on Thursday, the 1st of December, denounced myths about Russian aggression and expressed hope that the incoming US administration would then work with Moscow to fight terrorism. And I wonder if this is an olive branch or this is actually Maskarovka. Well, time alone will tell. Let me leave that and turn now to Brexit. Next slide, please. I've put on here that Brexit is a journey to an unknown destination, and you can see, bearing in mind what I said about the post-truth era, some of the messages that were around. Let's give our NHS the 350 million the EU takes every week. That's absolute baloney. The net cost to the British economy was some 7 billion a year, and actually, because of Brexit, by the next couple of years, we will find ourselves 31 billion every year in debt, and the overall level of debt will increase in the United Kingdom. Next slide, please. there was a feeling of let's take back control, and this is where it comes back to this idea of freedom. We don't want any more the people in Europe telling us what to do. And there's a subtle cartoon you can see on the right there. I think it's David Davis and Boris Johnson on their horses hunting. Liam Fox is the fox, and I think there's Angela Merkel and Mr. Juncker at the back. Next slide, please. So what do these people, the Brexiteers, really want? Well, they seem to divide into three. The utopianists really didn't want the Britain to be polluted by foreigners. They wanted British jobs for Brits. The Euros were getting British benefits and needed to be stopped helping themselves to our economy. Britain needed to be great again, and we didn't want the ever closer union. Those were the utopianists. The gripers, on the other hand, were somewhere in the middle. They saw that Britain was paying out an awful lot of money, $350 million per week, it said. EU law was a burden. We couldn't have our own British sausage anymore. Brussels decides everything we wanted to do. There was a bureaucracy that farmers had to adhere to. They didn't worry about their crops so much. They had to fill in forms. The euro was supposedly costing the pound its value, and we couldn't form our own separate trade agreements. And then there's the other group, the opportunists, who said that the European Union is probably going to fail. We've seen what happens with Brexit and how close to the border we came with the Greek economy just recently. There are many more opportunities with China and India. And indeed, if you look at the European army, that is going to undermine NATO, and we don't want that to happen. We want NATO to remain strong. So there we are. That is what the various Brexiteers said. Next slide, please. And if you look at what the papers were saying on the day of the actual election, 4/5 of the British press, especially that controlled by Rupert Murdoch, wanted to leave. And look at the headlines: Vote Leave today. Britain will roar out of the EU. Your country, your vote. Independence Day, day of reckoning. Betrayal of Britain. Interestingly, the top left-hand corner, only the Daily Mirror, said, don't take a leap into the dark. Probably not quite the people you would expect. Next slide, please. So when we look at the lines in the sand, there is indeed an increase, as you can see from the left part of this slide, in migration. And most of it has come from the newer Eastern European countries, Bulgaria and Hungary. But of course, it has to be pointed out that if that were to reduce, then because there is still a demand for cheap labour, then obviously the non-European immigrants will have to increase. I've put there, and I'm not going to dwell on it, the way in which Britain voted. Interestingly enough, the only real blue vote came from London and Scotland, and so that was the grouping that voted to remain. The rest, pretty much overwhelmingly, one way or another, voted against. Next slide, please. The Economist did a very interesting study, and I won't look at this in too much detail. Essentially, it runs like this. The more degrees you have, the more likely you are to remain. The fewer degrees you have, the more likely you are to vote to go. And age became another factor. The older you were, the more likely you were to vote to go, and the younger, the more likely to remain. Effectively, those that had the greatest impact of austerity, or received the greatest impact of austerity, were the more likely to vote go. Next slide, please. What was the effect of the Brexit? Okay. Well, the first thing is there was a decision over whether or not Brexit could be implemented as it currently stands. And it was put before the law courts, the High Court, and you can see the three judges that were there. There's the Lord Chief Justice of the United Kingdom, the Master of the Rolls, and another very senior legal advocate. They said that actually there were inherent rights in the Treaty of Rome given to individuals that could not be removed by royal prerogative. And it must go before Parliament, and Parliament must decide. Well, you can see what was branded there. On the day this decision was made, the Daily Mail said that the judges were enemies of the people. Well, if you're saying that the judges are the enemies of the people, one wonders who is not enemy of the people. And it seems to me that is a disgraceful thing to say. Next slide, please. Well, if we now look at what immediately happened following the vote, and you can see it's obviously the pound against the dollar, and you can see on the day after the vote, the pound fell by some 10%, virtually the next day. There's another drop-off you can see about 3/4 of the way along, following the speech by Theresa May at the Conservative Party conference, saying that probably there would be, or hinting there would be, a hard Brexit. The net effect is that the pound has fallen by some 18% over the period and is in a parlous situation. Next slide, please. Well, what has been the economic effect? Well, the pound, as I said, is already 18% down and probably will swing wildly over the next few months. Every time a minister says something that is ill-advised, the pound will go up or down in reflection. At the same time, of course, oil has gone up, and you'll know that it was assumed to be about $45 a barrel by 2020, and already it's just punched through following the last week's OPEC meeting of $50 a barrel. In addition to that, many of the businesses in Britain have gone to the government and said, we need assurances that we will be better placed to stay in Britain rather than move our factories across to somewhere in Europe. And those assurances have been given, and Nissan has decided to stay, and of course the other businesses will be seeking similar assurances. It is not known quite what those entail. At the same time, many of the farmers will be losing their casual labour from places like Bulgaria and so forth, and if alternative sources are not found for the labour, then of course the crops themselves will not be picked. So we'll be getting, ladies and gentlemen, no strawberries this year. Next slide, please. Well, let me turn now to defence and look at the effect on defence. This chap is General Sir Richard Barrons. He was the Commander-in-Chief of the Joint Forces Command, and he produced a hold-down report which went to the Secretary of State, which was then published in the papers completely illegally. And he said that although we have a reasonable capability in the war on terror, should we have to match against a peer competitor, in other words Russia, or to balance it in any way, then the forces were withered to such an extent they could not repel an all-out attack. Now you would have expected that a British public would have said this is outrageous, we're paying all this money for defence, but actually there was virtually nothing at all. No impact, no concern, and it just went away. Next slide, please. British defence spending, you can see from this graph, was already a long way down, and at 2% there's going to be a considerable pressure on British defence spending to be able to meet up to the commitments that we've already made. Next slide, please. Well, the first impact on British defence is the effect of the falling pound. If the pound falls by 18%, then of course the cost of all the things that one buys in the United States go up by 18%. We're committed to buying 24 of the F-35s on the left, hopefully going to be buying 48 before too long. We're committed to buying 9 P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft. All of them have gone up by 18%. And although there may be some hedging, it's difficult to see just how this can be afforded. In addition to that, Britain is due to have an Apache replacement. It's buying itself a new strategic nuclear ballistic missile defence. Many of the Typhoons are bought on the continent. We are buying Predators and we're buying weapons. It is difficult to see how all this can be afforded. Next slide, please. And then we come on to this issue. As Britain pulls out of Europe, we essentially give a free rein to, well, the Germans in particular. And Ursula von der Leyen, the German defence minister, has said it is about time that Europe now built up a European army. And for Britain, this will be disastrous because if a European army is built up, that will give them an excuse perhaps not to increase their defence expenditure. And also, it'll make people realise, well, if there's a European army, what value NATO? So Britain in particular will find itself neither protected by NATO, nor with a seat at the top table to decide what happens with the European army. Next slide, please. Next one. In fact, can we go on one more? Well, this leaves us in Britain with a bit of a cleft stick because whatever Theresa May does in the near future, we are going to have a problem. If there's a soft Brexit, which of course many people want, certainly all those that voted in terms of Remain, then of course EU immigration will continue and UKIP will have a cause célèbre to fight against. If we go for a hard Brexit, then of course, and we may actually just be kicked out if we can't realise any conditions at all, that will require economic austerity for probably 10 years. Whichever way it goes, I confidently predict that when the conditions are put before the British people, there will be a vote of no confidence at some time in 2019. Now, it was thought until just recently that Theresa May would be well advised to call a snap general election sometime during the early part of next year. But the defeat of Zach Goldsmith at Richmond Park that occurred just last week, where his 23,000 majority was turned into a defeat of 2,000 and the seat passed to the Liberal Democrats, largely because Zach Goldsmith is a Brexiteer and most of his constituents are not, rather signals to Theresa May that if she goes to the country, those that voted Remain will probably turf her out. So we then end up in a situation that she is in a real cleft stick. Is she going to go to the country early or hope that she can negotiate her way out? And indeed, we then come to the problem politically. If we do depart and there is no source of labour, where will the immigrants come from? Will they come from the Commonwealth? Next slide, please. Next slide. So we come to Brexit, and I have to tell you that right now it is virtually the sole British issue. There is virtually nothing in the British papers apart from Brexit, Brexit for, Brexit against, and this week in particular, the Supreme Court from today is ruling whether Parliament is rightful authority to trigger Article 50. Can royal prerogative be used to take away the inherent right of UK citizens under Article 50? Does Article 50 also trigger withdrawal from the exclusive European Economic Area? And that is another question. What will happen over immigration? Will that be stopped or will we accept it? Once the negotiations are complete, who then will say that these negotiations and these conditions are acceptable? Will it be the government? Yes, that's fine. Will it be Parliament? Or will there have to be another plebiscite? And then, of course, we come finally to the status of Scotland and indeed Northern Ireland post the plebiscite, post-Brexit. Will there still be a United Kingdom at 2019 and beyond? Well, enough of that. Let me turn now to what situation in America. Next slide, please. And the first question I've got for you is this. Who really is Mr. Donald Trump? Is he the man on the left, the compromise man, or is he the hard man on the right? And I should mention to you that one of the first people to congratulate him on his victory was Vladimir Putin. Next slide, please. Foreign policy. Well, it's difficult to work out what the foreign policy is, unlike the Democrats or indeed previous presidential candidates where there were papers and briefing notes, there have been none. So this is culled from what has been said and what is believed. It's believed that Donald Trump sees the world as chaotic and threatening. He has said he will put America first, he'll reduce the US role in the world, he'll stop being the world's policeman. He is happy to use force, provided it's in the United States' interests. That means it's not necessarily in the interests of everybody else, and indeed where everybody else's interests is concerned, he won't necessarily commit US forces. He wants to diminish the commitment to the alliances. He's not committed to giving a nuclear guarantee to Europe or the Far East, and he said, therefore, that he does not see any difficulty with Japan, for example, having a bomb, or Saudi Arabia manufacturing a bomb. He wants to pull out of adverse trade agreements, that's WTO, NAFTA, Trans-Pacific Partnership, and even the Paris Agreement on climate change. Well, we'll see. On immigration, he's already said that he wants to reduce immigration so that he can control the Muslim immigration, and he said that Mexicans will not be allowed to cross, and of course he's committed to building a wall and imposing tariffs. Next slide, please. As far as Russia is concerned, he says his foreign policy is based on mutual respect. And he said he is entirely happy over Syria to align with Russia's Syrian ally. Okay, so that obviously indicates a change, but maybe by the time he comes to power, that situation will be resolved anyway. On Ukraine and Crimea, is he going to continue with economic sanctions? Well, that he hasn't said anything about. What he has said, however, is he tends to renegotiate the Iranian bomb treaty. But then I suggest to you that if he does, or if he repudiates the Iranian bomb treaty, all that will happen is Iran will just build a bomb all the quicker. Is he likely to agree to the spheres of influence that Vladimir Putin wants, certainly in the eastern part of Europe, or indeed in the Middle East? Is he going to negotiate this by a series of deals? Then we come on to China. He's already said that he might impose something like a 35% tariff on Mexican stuff, Mexican imports that come in. Would he propose the same sort of thing on Chinese imports? Because if that happens, then I suggest that Chinese economy will probably collapse, and as a result of that, world trade would go into difficulties. Then we come on to the South China Sea issue. Well, as you know, he spoke to the president of Taiwan recently, and that, of course, will give him all sorts of grief with China in the near future. And we shouldn't forget, of course, that his country is heavily in hock to China anyway. On the F-35 future is in some doubt. Not only would the United States find it extremely difficult if the F-35 were not to go ahead, but also all the European nations that have contracted to buy it. And then I've said at the bottom, as I just mentioned, that we have a situation where Iran would just make the bomb if that were the case. Next slide, please. What he has said, though, as far as Europe is concerned, is that everybody must pay more in Europe. And the line I've put vertically down there is the 2% line. You can see just those nations that are paying enough. And the United States, it should be said, pays about 70% of the total cost of NATO at present. And although the percentage of GDP looks impressive for places like Greece, of course Greece doesn't have much of a GDP, so its actual expenditure is not that high. But then you look at the top and you look at Germany at 1.38%, and you realise that some nations are not frankly pulling their weight. Would he, what would Mr. Trump do? And one suggestion is perhaps he would say to places like Hungary, Belgium, Germany, Spain, and the pieces from the top, we will only guarantee Article 5 to you, provided and when you actually achieve the 2% limit. And then, of course, we have the whole issue of the European army and whether that's an alternative to NATO. Next slide, please. So where do we sit? Well, we sit really at a pendulum. You know, on the one hand, wise counsel may prevail. Russia could avoid involvement in Ukraine and keep well clear of that, and gas and oil could flow freely. The Brexit could go for the soft option. The UK maintains its defence status quo, find some more money. Mr. Trump encourages NATO to come up to the 2% over a period of time and maintains his interest in the NATO leadership. Of course, at the other end, Russia could find that it's encouraged by what's going on and decide to put more pressure on the Baltics. Turkey, already starting to make overtures to Russia, could become less and less of a NATO player. There could be nuclear play. I don't mean nuclear explosions, but I do mean nuclear threats and nuclear coercion. The UK could be into a hard Brexit. Defence would be cut back still further. And I've already said that Britain already has virtually no appetite for anything but Brexit. UK could largely withdraw and retreat back into its little island fortress. Is Trump going to apply a 2% hard criterion, become isolationist, and go for brinkmanship? And what will happen to NATO? Well, will NATO just fragment? Will the European Union just fragment? Will there be a European army? And will it actually be funded out of 1% rather than the 2%? Next slide, please. But in all this, we can't forget that we have cause and effect. Every single effect that takes place will rebound across the world. And it's not just like a pendulum, it's more like these swinging balls. Every movement of the red ball will impact on China, India, Turkey, and the Middle East, and then bounce back onto the red ball. Ladies and gentlemen, that completes my presentation. Thank you very much.